Hey guys, tonight we begin with a question that's far more complicated than it sounds. How did the ancient Greeks stay clean? So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And let me know in the comments where you're tuning in from and what time it is for you. It's always fascinating to see who's joining us from around the world. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum. And let's ease into tonight's journey together. Picture Athens, 450 BC. The sun is merciless. Dust coats every surface like a second skin. You've been walking through the agora all morning, haggling over olives and dodging donkey droppings. Your tunic clings to your body with a film of sweat that's somewhere between uncomfortable and alarming. And yet, somehow, you're expected to present yourself at a symposium tonight looking like a civilized human being. No soap, no running water in your home, no shower waiting with perfect temperature control. Just you, some oil, a scraping tool, and the collective hope that everyone else smells worse. The ancient Greeks didn't have what we'd call hygiene in the modern sense. They had something else entirely, a complex system of rituals, public spaces, and cultural expectations that kept an entire civilization from collapsing under the weight of its own body odor. It wasn't perfect. It probably wasn't pleasant by today's standards. But it worked well enough that Greek culture flourished for centuries without a single bar of Irish Spring. So how did they do it? How did a society without plumbing, antibacterial anything, or even the concept of germs manage to stay clean enough to invent democracy, philosophy, and the Olympic Games? The answer involves more olive oil than you'd think possible, public bathing that bordered on performance art, and a relationship with the human body that was somehow both more relaxed and more obsessive than our own. Welcome to ancient Greek hygiene, where cleanliness wasn't next to godliness. It was godliness, just achieved through methods that would horrify a modern dermatologist. Let's start with the most fundamental problem: water. Not the lack of it exactly. Greece had springs, rivers, and a very long coastline. But getting that water from its source to your body in a controlled, sanitary way? That was the challenge. Most Greek homes, even in major cities like Athens or Corinth, had no running water. None. The average household didn't have a bathroom in any sense we'd recognize. No sink, no tub, no toilet that flushed. Water had to be carried, usually by women or slaves, from public fountains or wells. These fountains, often elaborately decorated and socially important gathering spots, were where the city's water supply met its citizens. Imagine starting your day by walking to the neighborhood fountain with a large ceramic vessel balanced on your head or hip. You'd wait in line, probably gossiping with neighbors, fill your container, and haul it back home. This water was precious. You weren't going to waste it on a leisurely shower. Every drop had to be budgeted: cooking, drinking, basic washing, and maybe, if you were lucky, a quick rinse at the end of the day. For most Greeks, daily washing happened in stages and never all at once. In the morning, you might splash your face and hands with water from a basin. A servant or family member would pour water over your hands from a special pitcher called an alpi, letting it drain into a shallow bowl. This ritual appears on countless Greek vases, which tells us it was both common and considered worthy of artistic representation. You dry yourself with a length of linen, and that was it. Morning hygiene complete. The truly wealthy might have had a bathtub in their homes, but even this wasn't what you're imagining. Greek bathtubs were typically large terracotta or stone basins that you'd step into and crouch in while someone poured water over you. It was less relaxing soak and more efficient rinse. The tub would be filled and emptied bucket by bucket, which meant bathing at home was a production involving multiple people and significant effort. For most Greeks, the idea of daily full-body bathing at home would have seemed wasteful and strange. Why go through all that trouble when the city provided something better? The public bath, or balneon, was where real cleaning happened. And the gymnasium, the training ground, offered facilities that combined exercise, socializing, and hygiene into one sweaty, oily, socially complex package. So the typical Greek's relationship with water was one of careful management. You used it sparingly at home for basic maintenance, and when you needed a real clean, you went public. This wasn't seen as a hardship. It was simply how things worked. The concept of private, daily, full-body washing in your own home would have struck most Greeks as extravagantly wasteful, like having a personal agora in your courtyard. But here's where it gets interesting. The Greeks didn't think they were dirty. They had standards, expectations, and a whole vocabulary around cleanliness. They just achieved it through completely different means than we do. And those means, bizarre as they might seem to us, were actually remarkably sophisticated for a pre-industrial society. Now, let's talk about the substance that defined Greek hygiene more than water ever did: olive oil. If you're picturing someone cooking dinner, you're not wrong. The same oil they used for food, they used for everything else, including what passed for bathing. The Greeks didn't have soap. Not in the way we understand it. The chemical process of saponification, mixing fats with alkaline substances to create soap, wasn't unknown in the ancient world. The Babylonians had figured it out. The Egyptians had something similar. But the Greeks, for reasons that remain somewhat mysterious, never really adopted soap as a widespread cleaning agent. Instead, they turned to what they had in abundance: olive oil. Here's how it worked, and try not to be horrified. Before exercising at the gymnasium, a Greek man, and it was almost always men in these spaces, would strip completely naked. This wasn't considered scandalous. The gymnasium comes from the word gymnos, meaning naked, so nudity was built right into the concept. Once undressed, he'd coat his entire body in olive oil. Not a light misting. A thorough, glistening coating that would make a modern personal trainer reach for paper towels in despair. Why will? Because it served multiple purposes. First, it protected the skin from the sun and wind during outdoor exercise. Greece is hot. The sun is unforgiving. A layer of oil acted like ancient sunscreen, though obviously much less effective than SPF 50. Second, it made the body more aesthetically pleasing. The Greeks were obsessed with the male form, and a well-oiled body caught the light beautifully, emphasizing muscle definition. Athletes weren't just training. They were also, consciously or not, participating in a kind of living sculpture display. But the third purpose was hygiene, or at least what the Greeks considered hygiene. The oil would mix with sweat and dust during exercise, creating a kind of paste that trapped dirt, dead skin, and whatever else was clinging to the body. This oil-dirt-sweat mixture was the whole point, because once you were thoroughly coated in it, you scraped it off. Enter the strigil, one of the most important objects in Greek daily life and one of the strangest to modern eyes. A strigil was a curved metal scraper, usually made of bronze or iron, shaped like an elongated C. After exercising, a Greek man would take his strigil, or have a slave or friend do it for him, and systematically scrape the oil-sweat-dirt mixture off his body. You'd start with your arms, then your torso, working down to your legs. The scraped-off mixture, called gloios, would fall to the ground or be collected in a container. And here's where it gets truly strange: gloios was valuable. That's right. The scraped-off sweat and oil of famous athletes was collected and sold. It was believed to have medicinal properties. People would pay good money for the gloios of a celebrated Olympic champion, rubbing it into their own skin or using it as an ointment for injuries. The sweat of Olympians was literally bottled and marketed. Ancient Greece had no concept of celebrity endorsement deals, but they somehow invented celebrity sweat commerce. For most people, though, gloios was just waste. You scraped it off, maybe rinsed with a bit of water, and you were done. By Greek standards, you were now clean. The oil had lifted the dirt, the strigil had removed it, and your skin, now slightly pink from scraping, was supposedly purified. To our modern minds, this seems insane. You're not washing away bacteria. You're not using any kind of antimicrobial agent. You're just spreading oil around, collecting some filth in it, and mechanically removing the worst of it. But remember, the Greeks had no concept of germs. They didn't know about bacteria or viruses. What they did know was that this process made their skin feel different, look different, and probably smell slightly less offensive than it had before. And in a society where everyone else was doing the same thing, that was clean enough. The strigil became such a symbol of Greek culture that it appears constantly in art. Vases show athletes using strigils on themselves or each other. Statues of athletes often include a strigil as an attribute, the way a warrior might hold a sword. It was a marker of civilization, of someone who participated in the proper rituals of Greek society. To be strigilless was to be somehow outside the bounds of acceptable culture. Women used oil too, though their experience was different. They weren't exercising naked in public gymnasiums, obviously. But they did use oil as a base for cosmetics, mixing it with white lead for foundation, yes, poisonous lead, and various plant extracts for color. They'd also oil their skin before using a strigil-like scraper in private, though the evidence for this is less abundant than it is for men. Greek society was far more interested in documenting and celebrating male bodies than female ones, so much of women's hygiene practices remain educated guesses based on scattered references. The point is, olive oil wasn't just a food or a light source. It was the foundation of Greek cleanliness. Every household had it. Every gymnasium provided it. It was so central to daily life that running out of oil would have been a minor crisis, like a modern household running out of toilet paper and shampoo simultaneously. And before we judge too harshly, consider this. The oil and scrape method probably worked reasonably well for surface-level cleaning. It removed the layer of dust, dead skin, and visible dirt that accumulated during a day in ancient Athens. It made people feel and smell better, at least temporarily. It didn't sterilize anything, but then again, neither does a modern shower unless you're using antibacterial soap and scrubbing thoroughly. Most of us are just rinsing off the day's accumulation, which is roughly what the Greeks were doing, just with more oil and less water. So when you think of ancient Greek hygiene, don't picture soap commercials. Picture men gleaming with oil under the Mediterranean sun, scraping themselves clean with bronze tools, and genuinely believing they'd achieved purity. Because by their standards, they had. But oil and scraping, while central, were only part of the hygiene picture. For a more thorough clean, a more social clean, the Greeks had another solution: the public bath. The balneon, or public bathhouse, was where Greeks went when they wanted to feel genuinely refreshed. These weren't the massive, elaborate complexes the Romans would later build. Greek baths were usually smaller, more modest affairs, but they served a crucial social and hygienic function. Early Greek baths were simple: a room with a stone or clay floor sloped toward a drain where water could be poured over bathers. Attendants, usually slaves, would heat water in large bronze vessels over fires, then pour it over customers who stood or crouched on the floor. You'd be doused with warm or hot water, probably mixed with more oil, and then scraped clean with, yes, another strigil. The process was similar to what happened at the gymnasium, just wetter and more thorough. By the classical period, baths had become more sophisticated. Some had individual tubs. Others had developed primitive shower systems, where water could be poured from above through perforated vessels, creating something like rainfall. These were luxury features, the kind of thing you'd brag about if your local bath had one. Oh, you should see the new shower system at the bath near the Dipylon Gate. Absolutely divine. Bathing was a social activity. You didn't go alone. You went with friends, colleagues, or business associates. The bath was where you caught up on gossip, made deals, and strengthened social bonds. It was casual and intimate at the same time. Everyone was naked, which eliminated the visual markers of social class, clothing, jewelry, and created a kind of temporary equality. Though, of course, the rich could afford to go to nicer baths more often, so the equality was always somewhat theoretical. The experience typically followed a pattern. You'd arrive at the bath, pay a small fee to the attendant, maybe an obol or two, and strip in the changing area. You'd proceed to the washing room, where you'd either be doused with water or step into a tub. An attendant might scrub you with oil and a cloth or sponge, really working to loosen dirt and dead skin. Then came the strigil scraping again, because apparently you could never scrape yourself enough in ancient Greece. Finally, you'd rinse with clean water and dry off with linen towels. The whole process might take an hour or more, depending on how much you wanted to socialize. Some baths also offered additional services: massage, hair plucking, because Greek ideals of beauty included minimal body hair for men and women, and even primitive steam rooms where heated stones would be sprinkled with water to create vapor. Women had their own bath times or separate facilities. Greek society was fairly strict about gender segregation in public spaces, though evidence suggests that some baths operated on a schedule: men in the morning, women in the afternoon. This meant that the bathhouse itself was gender-neutral space, just not at the same time. Women's bathing rituals were probably similar to men's, though again, our sources are frustratingly quiet on the specifics. We know they bathed. We know they used oil and scrapers. But the details are lost, considered either too mundane or too private to record. Children were brought to the baths by their mothers or nurses, and presumably this is where they learned the proper rituals of cleanliness. Bathing wasn't just hygiene. It was cultural education. You learned how to behave in public, how to interact with naked strangers politely, how to respect the communal space. The bath was a classroom for civilization. The water itself came from the city's supply, channeled through underground pipes or carried in from nearby sources. It wasn't heated in the bath itself initially. Instead, large bronze or clay vessels were filled and heated over fires, then carried to the bathing room. Later baths developed more sophisticated heating systems, with hypocausts, underfloor heating borrowed from the Romans, but that came much later and was never as widespread in Greece as it was in Rome. After bathing, Greeks might apply perfumed oils or ointments. These weren't just for scent. They were considered protective, keeping the skin supple and healthy. Popular scents included rose, myrrh, and various floral extracts. The wealthy could afford expensive imported perfumes. The poor made do with cheaper, locally produced oils. But everyone wanted to smell like something other than human. The bath was also where you went when you were sick. The Greeks believed that many illnesses could be treated with washing, a belief that was simultaneously completely wrong and accidentally somewhat correct. While bathing didn't cure disease, it probably did make sick people feel better temporarily and may have prevented some secondary infections by keeping skin cleaner. Physicians often prescribed bathing as part of treatment regimens, though they disagreed wildly on whether hot or cold water was better for various conditions. Public baths were so important to Greek life that cities without them were considered backward. A proper polis needed baths the way it needed temples and an agora. They were markers of civilization, proof that the city cared about the well-being of its citizens. During wartime, one of the cruelest things that could happen was for a city's water supply to be cut off, not just because people would die of thirst, but because the baths would close and everyone would be reduced to washing with whatever water they could scrounge. It was both a physical and a psychological blow. So when we picture ancient Greeks staying clean, we should picture them moving through a landscape of water and oil, from home to fountain to gymnasium to bath and back again. Each space had its own rituals, its own social rules, its own contribution to the project of staying clean enough to be considered civilized. It was a public project. Hygiene in ancient Greece wasn't something you did alone in your bathroom while podcasts played in the background. It was something you did with your community, in spaces designed for that purpose, following rituals everyone understood. And while it might seem strange or insufficient to us, it worked. Greek cities didn't collapse from epidemic disease any more often than other ancient cities. Greek people lived reasonably long lives by ancient standards. They produced philosophy, art, and literature that we still study today. They weren't dying in droves from poor hygiene. They had simply figured out a different way to be clean, one that worked within the constraints of their technology, their climate, and their culture. Now let's talk about what happened to all that oil, sweat, and dirt after it was scraped off. Because the Greeks, pragmatic as always, had opinions about waste. Gloios, that mixture of oil, sweat, and dust scraped from exercising bodies, was treated with a strange mix of reverence and disgust. For most people, it was garbage. The floor of the gymnasium would be covered with it by the end of the day, a slippery, smelly mess that had to be cleaned up by the lowest-ranking slaves. These floor cleaners had possibly the worst job in ancient Athens, scraping gloios off stone floors with wooden implements and hauling it away in buckets. But for the gloios of famous athletes, a different fate awaited. As mentioned earlier, this stuff was collected and sold. Merchants would contract with gymnasiums for the rights to collect the scrapings of celebrated competitors. They'd bottle it, sometimes mix it with other ingredients, and sell it as medicine or cosmetic treatment. The logic, if you can call it that, was that the physical excellence of great athletes was somehow contained in their sweat and could be transferred to others through application. This sounds insane, and it was. But it's not actually that different from modern celebrity culture. We might not bottle their sweat, though some fans probably would if they could, but we buy their perfumes, their clothing lines, their skincare routines. The Greeks were just more literal about it. They wanted a piece of excellence, and if that piece was slightly sweaty and covered in dust, so be it. The trade in athlete gloios was apparently common enough that it shows up in medical texts. Physicians would sometimes prescribe it for joint pain or skin conditions, though whether any of them actually believed it worked or were just going along with popular demand is unclear. Placebos, after all, can be effective regardless of their contents. Regular human waste, the kind produced by everyone, was handled differently. Greek cities didn't have sewer systems in the Roman sense. There was no cloaca maxima carrying everything away to the sea. Instead, waste disposal was a chaotic mix of public and private solutions. Most homes had a chamber pot, essentially a large ceramic vessel kept in a corner for nighttime use. During the day, you'd ideally use a public latrine if one was nearby, but if not, well, corners of alleys served in a pinch. The chamber pot would be emptied in the morning, usually by slaves, who'd carry it to a designated dump site outside the city walls or pour it into a cesspit if the house had one. Public latrines existed in most cities, usually simple structures with a bench containing holes over a running water channel or a pit. These were communal spaces, no privacy, no stalls, just a row of holes where you'd sit next to your fellow citizens and take care of business. The Romans would later make these into social venues, but the Greeks treated them more pragmatically. They were a place to defecate, not to hold philosophical debates, though surely some debates happened there anyway. The lack of comprehensive sewage systems meant that Greek cities, especially in summer, smelled bad. They just did. Between human waste, animal waste, garbage, and the general funk of thousands of people living in close quarters without deodorant, the smell would have been overwhelming by modern standards. The Greeks dealt with this by burning incense, wearing perfume, and apparently just getting used to it. Olfactory adaptation is a powerful thing. What seems unbearable at first becomes normal if you're exposed to it constantly. This is part of why the gymnasium and bath were so important. They were escapes from the general smell of the city. In these spaces, the air was perfumed with oil, scented ointments, and relatively clean water. They were olfactory oases in a fairly stinky world. The Greeks also had a complicated relationship with urine. Unlike the Romans, who famously collected it for use in tanning leather and fulling cloth, the Greeks seemed less interested in industrial applications. But they did recognize that urine had cleaning properties. It was sometimes used, diluted with water, to clean fabrics or to treat certain skin conditions. The ammonia in urine is actually an effective cleanser, so this wasn't entirely irrational, just deeply unpleasant. Animal waste was everywhere. Horses, donkeys, dogs, and various livestock shared the streets with humans. Their waste was left where it fell, to be washed away by rain or eventually collected by someone assigned the task. In theory, there were public slaves responsible for street cleaning. In practice, enforcement was sporadic, and the streets of most Greek cities were probably navigational challenges, especially after market days. Given all this, the fastidiousness about personal cleanliness makes more sense. When your environment is inevitably dirty, maintaining personal cleanliness becomes a way of asserting control, of creating a boundary between self and filth. The strigil, the bath, the oiled skin, these were ways of saying, I may live in a city that smells like a livestock pen, but I, personally, am clean. This also explains the Greek obsession with washing hands before eating. If you're going to eat with your hands, which the Greeks did, and your environment is constantly contaminated with various kinds of waste, hand washing becomes genuinely important. The ritual of having water poured over your hands before a meal wasn't just politeness. It was practical disease prevention, even if the Greeks didn't understand the mechanism. So waste management in ancient Greece was minimal, chaotic, and deeply unpleasant by modern standards. But it created the context in which Greek hygiene practices developed. When you can't control the cleanliness of your environment, you compensate by controlling the cleanliness of your body. And the Greeks, unable to keep their cities perfectly clean, became obsessed with keeping their bodies as clean as their technology allowed. Let's move now to a space that combined athletics, socializing, and hygiene into one sweaty, oily institution, the gymnasium. The gymnasium was central to Greek life in a way that's hard to overstate. It wasn't just where you exercised. It was where you were educated, where you socialized, where you proved your citizenship, and where you performed elaborate hygiene rituals that were as much about status and belonging as they were about actual cleanliness. Every Greek city of any size had at least one gymnasium. Major cities like Athens had several. The most famous, the Academy, the Lyceum, the Synesarges, were named spaces where specific philosophical schools would later develop. But even small towns had a basic gymnasium, a courtyard with a running track, some space for wrestling, and crucially, facilities for oiling and scraping. The gymnasium was for men and boys only, a male space where nudity was not just accepted but required. Women had their own exercise areas, usually at home or in secluded outdoor spaces, but they weren't part of the public gymnasium culture. This gender segregation was absolute and considered essential to proper social order. A typical day at the gymnasium would begin with the ritual of oiling. Large ceramic vessels of olive oil were kept on hand, and athletes would pour liberal amounts over their bodies. The process was assisted by others, slaves or fellow athletes, because coating your own back thoroughly is difficult. This mutual oiling was part of the social bonding of the space. You helped your friends get properly slick before exercise, and they'd return the favor. Once oiled, you'd proceed to your chosen activity. Running, wrestling, boxing, javelin throwing, discus, or just general strength training. The Greeks approached athletics seriously. This wasn't casual gym culture. Training was intense, competitive, and often brutal. Broken bones, torn muscles, and worse were common. The oil coating didn't prevent injuries, but it may have reduced scrapes and friction burns slightly. After exercise, you'd be covered in dirt, especially if you'd been wrestling. Greek wrestling took place in a sand pit, and sand would coat your oiled body in a gritty, uncomfortable layer. This is when the strigil came out. You'd work systematically, scraping the oil-dirt sweat mixture from your skin. The scraping itself was vigorous, almost aggressive. You weren't being gentle with your skin. You were removing a layer of filth, and you did it with pressure. The gymnasium provided water for rinsing after scraping, though not enough for what we'd call a shower. More like a quick splash to remove the last residue. Some gymnasiums had fountain areas where you could douse yourself. Others just had basins where you'd scoop water and pour it over yourself. Attendants were available for hire if you wanted someone else to handle the scraping and rinsing, a common choice for wealthy men who considered such labor beneath their dignity. The space itself was designed around these rituals. The gymnasiums had covered colonnades, stoas, where men could rest, talk, and dry off in the shade. There were rooms for storing oil and equipment. Some gymnasiums had small shrines to Hermes or Hercules, gods associated with athletics and male excellence. Sacrifices were made before major competitions, and sometimes just before training, because every activity in ancient Greece seemed to require at least a small gesture toward the divine. But the gymnasium wasn't just about physical training. It was also an educational space. Teachers would instruct boys in music, poetry, mathematics, and eventually philosophy. Some of the greatest philosophical schools began as informal gatherings at gymnasiums, where students would exercise, clean themselves, and then gather to hear lectures. Plato's academy was originally an olive grove with a gymnasium. Aristotle's Lyceum was another. This combination of physical and intellectual development was fundamental to Greek ideals of education, paideia. You couldn't have a truly educated person who was only physically strong or only intellectually sharp. You needed both, cultivated together in the same space. The famous phrase, "a sound mind in a sound body," captures this perfectly, though it's actually Latin and comes later. The Greeks just lived it without needing a catchy slogan. The social dynamics of the gymnasium were complex. Age and status mattered. Older men exercised separately from boys. Citizens had better access than non-citizens. Slaves weren't allowed in as participants, only as attendants. The gymnasium was a space where social hierarchies were both erased through shared nudity and reinforced through who could attend and when. Nudity itself was a statement. To exercise naked was to claim Greek identity. Barbarians, non-Greeks, wore clothes while exercising, which the Greeks found bizarre and faintly ridiculous. How can you even move properly with fabric restricting you? They'd wonder. Nudity in the gymnasium wasn't erotic, at least not primarily, though clearly there was a homoerotic element to Greek culture that found expression in these spaces. But officially, nudity was about freedom, both physical and social. It said, "I'm comfortable in my body. I'm Greek. I belong here." After exercise and cleaning, men would often linger. The gymnasium was a social club, a networking venue, a place to see and be seen. Business deals were made there. Political alliances formed. Gossip spread. You'd anoint yourself with perfumed oil, the expensive kind, not the cheap stuff used for exercise, dress in fresh clothing, and spend hours just talking with other men. For the wealthy, this was how they spent a significant portion of their day. The gymnasium also served a military purpose. The physical training it provided was directly applicable to warfare. Running, throwing, and especially wrestling were all combat-relevant skills. Greek soldiers were expected to maintain physical fitness, and the gymnasium was where they did it. Before a military campaign, soldiers would intensify their training at the gymnasium, preparing their bodies for the violence to come. So when we think about Greek hygiene, we have to understand the gymnasium as the central processing unit of male cleanliness. It was where men went to deliberately get dirty through exercise, then to get clean again through oil and scraping, then to feel civilized again through social interaction. It was a cycle repeated daily or every few days, a rhythm that structured Greek male life as thoroughly as work or family. And for all its strangeness, the gymnasium worked. It kept Greek men relatively clean. It built social bonds. It reinforced cultural identity. It was, in its way, one of the most successful institutions in ancient Greece, lasting for centuries and influencing later cultures, including Rome, which borrowed and modified the concept. The fact that this central institution of Greek civilization was essentially a place where men got naked, covered themselves in oil, exercised, and then scraped the oil off tells us something important about the Greeks. They were practical, unafraid of the body, and willing to turn necessity, in this case the need to stay clean without modern technology, into an elaborate social and cultural performance. That's very Greek. Now, let's shift from men to women, whose relationship with cleanliness was similar in some ways but drastically different in others, mostly because Greek society wasn't particularly interested in documenting women's daily lives unless those women were causing problems. Greek women's hygiene practices are frustratingly underdocumented. Most of our written sources were produced by men, for men, about men. Women appear in these texts primarily when they intersect with male concerns: marriage, childbirth, scandal. Their daily routines, including how they stayed clean, were considered too mundane or too private to record in detail. What we do know comes from fragments: vase paintings showing women at basins, archaeological evidence from houses, passing mentions in plays and medical texts, and the occasional complaint from male authors about women's cosmetic practices. From these pieces, we can reconstruct a rough picture, though it's always somewhat speculative. Women didn't go to the gymnasium. That space was absolutely closed to them. Nor did they exercise publicly in the way men did, with the exception of Sparta, where women engaged in physical training, much to the horror of other Greeks. So the male pattern of exercise oil scrape rinse didn't apply to most Greek women. Instead, women's cleaning happened primarily at home, in private spaces. Wealthy households had rooms where women would gather, separate from the male areas of the house. Here, they'd bathe, dress, and apply cosmetics with the help of female slaves. The process was elaborate and time-consuming. Bathing for women likely involved the same basin and pitcher method used by men at home, but with more attention to specific body parts and cosmetic preparation. Women would wash their faces, hands, and feet regularly. Full-body bathing happened less frequently, maybe once or twice a week, using water heated over the household fire and poured into a large basin or small tub. Oil was crucial here too. Women used olive oil as a base for cosmetics and as a skin moisturizer. They'd mix it with white lead to create a face paste that lightened the skin, because pale skin was associated with indoor life and thus with respectability and wealth. Women who had to work outdoors had tan skin, which marked them as lower class. So women who could afford it painted themselves as pale as possible, despite the fact that the lead was slowly poisoning them. Other cosmetics included rouge made from various plant extracts, mixed with oil, for cheeks and lips. Eyebrows were enhanced with charcoal or soot. Some women even used hair dyes, often recipes that sound absolutely terrifying, mixtures of lead oxide, quicklime, and other substances that definitely shouldn't go near human hair but apparently did anyway. The application of these cosmetics was a ritual in itself. Women would sit while slaves worked on their faces, carefully building up layers of foundation, adding color, perfecting the look. It took hours, was probably uncomfortable, and required constant maintenance since lead-based makeup tended to crack and flake. But it was considered essential to feminine beauty. Bathing for women also had different social implications. When they did go to public baths, usually at times when men weren't present, it was a rare opportunity for socializing outside the home. Women of different households would gather, exchange news, and conduct the kind of social business that was otherwise difficult in a culture that restricted women's movements so thoroughly. Greek medical texts suggest that women were prescribed baths for various gynecological issues. Physicians believed that many female complaints could be treated with warm water, vapor baths, or sitting over heated substances. Some of these treatments were probably helpful, in the sense that warmth can relieve cramping. Others were based on completely incorrect ideas about female anatomy and were useless or actively harmful. Hair care was another elaborate process. Greek women typically wore their hair long and styled it in complex ways involving braids, twists, and decorative hairpins. Washing hair was a production. It required significant amounts of water, time to dry, and then time to restyle. As a result, hair washing probably didn't happen frequently, maybe once a month or less. Between washes, women would use scented oils to keep their hair looking and smelling acceptable. Perfume was essential. Women wore it heavily, both to mask body odor and as a status symbol. The best perfumes were imported from Egypt or the East and were outrageously expensive. Common women used cheaper, locally produced scents, often floral oils or herb infusions. The goal was to be surrounded by a cloud of pleasant scent that would precede you and linger after you left. Young girls learned these practices from their mothers and female slaves. The preparation of a bride for her wedding was an extended ritual of bathing, oiling, and adorning that could take days. Special bridal baths, using water from sacred springs, were considered essential. The bride had to be purified and beautified before being handed over to her husband, and this process involved the most elaborate hygiene and cosmetic procedures a woman would experience. One significant difference between male and female hygiene was the emphasis on hair removal. Greek women were expected to remove body hair, or at least the visible kind. This was done through plucking with tweezers made of bronze, or through the application of various depilatory pastes made from quicklime, arsenic, and other substances that sound more suitable for removing paint than hair. The process was painful and time-consuming, but it was considered necessary. A woman with visible body hair was seen as uncivilized, too close to animals. Men also practiced some hair removal, particularly athletes who wanted their oiled muscles to be clearly visible, but the expectation was less universal. Women, on the other hand, were supposed to be as hairless as possible, at least in public-facing areas. Menstruation added another layer of complexity to women's hygiene. The Greeks understood menstruation as a natural process, though they had some truly bizarre ideas about what it meant and why it happened. Women used cloth pads, essentially strips of linen or wool that would be washed and reused. These had to be changed regularly and cleaned thoroughly, adding to the daily labor of household hygiene management. Pregnancy and childbirth brought their own hygiene challenges. Pregnant women were prescribed various baths and washes, supposedly to ensure healthy delivery. After childbirth, new mothers underwent elaborate purification rituals involving bathing and sacrifice, because birth, while celebrated, was also considered polluting in a ritual sense. The pollution had to be washed away before the mother could rejoin normal household life. So women's hygiene in ancient Greece was a complex, private, labor-intensive project. It happened in domestic spaces with the help of other women. It involved many of the same substances as male hygiene, oil, water, scrapers, but applied in different contexts and for different social purposes. Where male hygiene was public, athletic, and communal, female hygiene was private, cosmetic, and domestic. And while we don't have as much detail as we'd like, what we do know suggests that Greek women were just as concerned with cleanliness and appearance as Greek men. They just had to achieve it within much more restrictive social boundaries. They couldn't go to the gymnasium. They couldn't exercise naked in public. They couldn't socialize freely at the baths. So they created their own rituals, their own standards, and their own complex relationship with cleanliness that worked within the spaces available to them. The result was a society where both genders had elaborate hygiene practices, but those practices rarely overlapped. Men and women stayed clean in parallel, not together, each within their own prescribed sphere. It was, like most things in ancient Greece, deeply unequal but also deeply structured. Everyone had a role, everyone had expectations, and everyone more or less met them. Let's turn now to something we've mentioned but haven't fully explored: the role of smell in Greek culture and how it related to their ideas about cleanliness. The ancient Greeks were deeply concerned with how they smelled. This might seem obvious, every culture is, but the Greeks elevated smell to a philosophical and moral category. They believed that smell could indicate character, health, and even divine favor. A good smell was evidence of virtue. A bad smell suggested something wrong, either physically or spiritually. This is why perfume was so important. It wasn't just cosmetic. It was moral armor. To smell good was to announce that you were civilized, healthy, and right with the gods. Conversely, to smell bad, especially when you had the means to smell good, suggested moral failure. The Greeks had an extensive vocabulary for describing smells. They distinguished between different kinds of pleasant scents: floral, resinous, spicy, musky. They also had many terms for unpleasant odors, and these terms often carried moral judgments. The smell of sweat after honest labor was acceptable, even virtuous. The smell of unwashed poverty was pitiable. The smell of someone who could afford to smell good but didn't? That was contemptible. Perfume production was a sophisticated industry. The best perfumes came from specific regions known for particular scents. Roses from Rhodes, myrrh from Arabia, iris from Corinth. These were blended with oil, usually olive oil, to create complex fragrances. The most expensive perfumes might contain a dozen different ingredients, each carefully balanced. Wealthy Greeks would change perfumes depending on the occasion. There were scents for exercise, for dining, for religious ceremonies, for the bedroom. Some scents were considered masculine, others feminine. Wearing the wrong perfume for the wrong occasion was a social error, like wearing a tuxedo to a beach party. The application of perfume was also ritualized. You didn't just splash it on. You applied it to specific body parts: the neck, behind the ears, the wrists, the chest. Some Greeks even perfumed their breath by chewing aromatic herbs or applying scented oils inside the mouth. Bad breath was considered particularly offensive, and there were various folk remedies involving mint, anise, and other herbs. The smell of the gods themselves was a topic of philosophical and theological discussion. Gods were believed to smell impossibly good, a divine fragrance that was qualitatively different from any earthly scent. When gods visited Earth, their presence was announced by an overwhelming pleasant smell. Conversely, pollution, ritual, or physical, was associated with bad smells. A corpse, blood from a wound, menstrual blood, these all produced miasma, a polluting stench that required purification. This connection between smell and spiritual state meant that hygiene wasn't just practical. It was religious. To present yourself at a temple smelling bad was not just rude. It was impious. You had to be clean, both physically and ritually, to approach the gods. This involved bathing, perfuming, and sometimes fasting to avoid the smell of digestion. Interestingly, the Greeks also believed that different foods produced different bodily odors. Garlic, onions, and beans were all considered to produce unpleasant smells and were sometimes avoided before important social events. Athletes might follow special diets not just for physical performance but to control their body odor. The idea that you are what you eat extended to smell. Certain groups were stereotyped by smell. Barbarians supposedly smelled like butter because they ate dairy products and used butter in ways Greeks found disgusting. The poor smelled like cheap oil and labor. The wealthy smelled like imported perfumes and leisure. These stereotypes reinforced social hierarchies through olfactory categorization. The practice of burying or cremating the dead with aromatic substances, myrrh, frankincense, oils, was partly practical, masking the smell of decay, but also spiritual, helping the deceased transition to the afterlife with the right olfactory signature. There were even philosophical debates about smell. Some philosophers argued that the best smell was no smell, that true purity was odorless. Others maintained that pleasant scents were part of the good life and should be enjoyed. Socrates, ever the contrarian, reportedly cared little for perfume and thought the whole thing was wasteful vanity. His students ignored him and perfumed themselves anyway. The connection between cleanliness and smell in Greek thought created interesting complications. You could be technically clean by Greek standards, oiled and scraped, but still smell bad if you hadn't applied enough perfume or the right kind. Conversely, someone who hadn't properly cleaned might temporarily mask it with expensive scents, though this was considered cheating and would be criticized if discovered. The gymnasium, despite being a center of hygiene, must have smelled extraordinary. Imagine the combination: dozens of men covered in oil, exercising to the point of exhaustion, mixing sweat with dust and sand, then scraping it all off while other men waited their turn, all in an enclosed or semi-enclosed space under the Mediterranean sun. Add in the perfumes applied afterward, and you have an olfactory experience that would probably overwhelm a modern nose. Yet to the Greeks, this was the smell of civilization, of masculine excellence, of culture itself. So when we think about Greek cleanliness, we can't separate it from Greek attitudes about smell. They weren't just trying to remove dirt. They were trying to achieve a specific olfactory state that signaled their place in society, their virtue, and their relationship with the divine. Smell was meaning. And controlling your smell was controlling your identity. This makes their hygiene practices seem less strange. Yes, they used oil instead of soap. Yes, they scraped themselves with metal tools. But they were pursuing an ideal of cleanliness that was as much about smell as about the removal of visible dirt. And for that purpose, oil and perfume worked remarkably well, even if they wouldn't satisfy modern germ theory. The legacy of Greek hygiene practices extended far beyond ancient Greece itself. When Rome conquered the Greek world, they didn't just take their art and philosophy. They took their baths. Roman bathing culture is justly famous, and it's directly descended from Greek practices. The Romans took the Greek balneum and made it bigger, more elaborate, and more technologically sophisticated. The result was the thermae, massive public bath complexes that became the centers of Roman social life. But the basic idea that public bathing was civilized and necessary came from Greece. The Romans also adopted the strigil, though they tended to use it in combination with actual soap, which they either developed themselves or borrowed from Celtic peoples. Roman bathers would apply oil, scrape with a strigil, and then wash with soap before rinsing. This combined approach was probably more effective than either method alone, though it was also more expensive and time-consuming. What the Romans didn't keep was the gymnasium culture. They had their own athletic traditions, but they never quite understood the Greek connection between physical training, intellectual education, and social bonding that the gymnasium embodied. Roman exercise was more practical, more military, less philosophical. The Byzantine Empire, the eastern continuation of Rome, preserved Greek and Roman bathing traditions for another 1,000 years. Byzantine baths were famous throughout the medieval world, and their sophistication was one of the things that shocked Western European crusaders when they arrived in Constantinople. These people bathe regularly and have buildings designed for it. How decadent! Also, can I use the bath? I haven't washed properly in 3 years. In the Islamic world, which inherited much of Greek and Roman culture after the Arab conquests, the hammam or Turkish bath became central to urban life. The hammam is a direct descendant of the Roman thermae, which was itself descended from the Greek balneum. The rituals of the hammam, the progression through rooms of different temperatures, the massage, the scrubbing, all have roots in Greek practice, filtered through Roman and Byzantine intermediaries. Medieval Europe largely lost the bathing culture of the classical world. After the fall of the Western Roman Empire, public baths mostly disappeared. The Christian Church had complicated feelings about bathing, associating public baths with the moral corruption of the pagan past. By the Middle Ages, bathing had become rare in much of Europe, a weekly or even monthly affair rather than a daily or near-daily practice. When bathing culture returned to Europe during the Renaissance, it came partly through rediscovery of classical texts and partly through contact with the Islamic world. European elites learned from Greek and Roman sources that civilized people bathed regularly, and they tried to recreate those practices. The result was mixed. Full classical-style bathing didn't really return until the modern period, but the idea that bathing was civilized, that it was something educated people did, came directly from classical precedent. The modern shower, that pinnacle of personal hygiene technology, is in some ways the fulfillment of Greek bathing ideals: daily, private, thorough, done with running water and soap. It's everything the Greeks wanted but couldn't quite achieve with their technology. Yet there's something lost too. The social element, the sense of bathing as a communal activity that reinforced social bonds, that's mostly gone. We clean ourselves in isolation, which is more hygienic but less human in some ways. The Greeks also gave us the word hygiene itself, from Hygeia, the goddess of health. Her symbols were the serpent and the cup, and she represented cleanliness, sanitation, and prevention of disease. The Hippocratic medical tradition, which originated in Greece, emphasized the importance of cleanliness in treating patients and preventing illness. While the Greeks didn't understand germ theory, they observed that clean environments and clean bodies seemed to correlate with better health. They were right, even if their explanations were wrong. Modern athletic culture owes a debt to the Greek gymnasium tradition. The idea that physical education should be part of a well-rounded education, that sports build character and social skills, that exercise is virtuous, all of this comes from Greek precedent. When we build school gymnasiums and require physical education, we're following a model established in Athens 2,500 years ago. Even the concept of the spa, that modern escape where we go to be pampered and cleaned and relaxed, has Greek roots. The word spa itself comes from the Belgian town of Spa, famous for its healing waters, but the concept of a healing place centered on bathing goes back to ancient Greek and Roman practice. Every luxury spa that offers olive oil treatments is, whether they know it or not, participating in a tradition that stretches back to the gymnasiums of Athens. So Greek hygiene practices never entirely disappeared. They evolved, merged with other traditions, were lost and rediscovered, were modified and improved, but they left traces throughout Western culture. Every time we shower before going out, we're following the Greek intuition that cleanliness is a social obligation. Every time we put on deodorant or perfume, we're continuing the Greek project of olfactory self-presentation. Every time we exercise and then clean ourselves, we're repeating, in modified form, the cycle that Greek men performed at the gymnasium. The Greeks proved that you didn't need modern technology to create a functioning hygiene system. What you needed was social commitment, shared spaces, and agreed-upon rituals. They showed that cleanliness is as much cultural as it is chemical, as much about social expectations as about the removal of microbes. And perhaps most importantly, they demonstrated that hygiene practices reveal deep truths about a culture. The Greek emphasis on public bathing tells us they valued community. Their use of oil and the strigil tells us they were practical and worked with what they had. Their connection between cleanliness and virtue tells us they believed the body was morally significant, not just a shell for the soul. Their gender-segregated hygiene spaces tell us their society was strictly divided by gender in ways we've largely moved past. Now let's dive deeper into something we've touched on but haven't fully explored: the medical understanding of cleanliness in ancient Greece and how physicians approached hygiene as part of their healing practice. The ancient Greeks didn't have germ theory. They had no concept of bacteria or viruses. Disease, to them, was caused by an imbalance of humors, the four bodily fluids that supposedly governed health: blood, phlegm, yellow bile, and black bile. When these were in balance, you were healthy. When they fell out of balance, you got sick. This seems completely wrong to modern ears, and in terms of mechanism, it was. But the treatments that arose from this theory sometimes worked anyway, often for the right reasons even if the explanations were wrong. Hippocrates, the father of Western medicine, and his followers wrote extensively about hygiene. The Hippocratic Corpus, a collection of medical texts from the 5th and 4th centuries BCE, contains detailed instructions about bathing, diet, exercise, and cleanliness. These physicians observed that people who bathed regularly seemed healthier than those who didn't. They noticed that wounds cleaned with water healed better than wounds left dirty. They saw that cities with good water supplies had fewer epidemics than cities with contaminated water. Their explanations for these observations were based on humor theory, but their practical advice was often sound. They recommended daily washing of the face and hands. They advised bathing the entire body at least weekly, more often if possible. They suggested that people avoid standing water and prefer running water for drinking and washing. They were right about all of this, even though they thought it worked by balancing humors rather than by removing pathogens. Greek physicians also understood that different people needed different hygiene regimens. Athletes, who sweated heavily and got covered in dust, needed more frequent and thorough cleaning than sedentary scholars. Pregnant women needed special baths and washes. The elderly needed gentler cleaning methods than the young. Children needed to be taught proper hygiene habits from an early age. This individualized approach to hygiene was remarkably sophisticated and shows that Greek medicine, while based on incorrect theory, was based on careful observation. The concept of miasma, pollution, was central to Greek medical and religious thought. Miasma was a kind of spiritual contamination that could come from various sources: Contact with corpses, bloodshed, childbirth, certain sexual acts, even bad luck. This contamination was believed to be contagious, spreading from person to person through proximity or touch. The cure was purification, which almost always involved washing. Interestingly, while miasma wasn't a scientifically accurate concept, it functions somewhat like an early disease transmission theory. If you believed that being near sick people could pollute you, you'd avoid them, which would actually reduce disease transmission. If you thought corpses were polluting and required immediate purification after contact, you'd wash your hands after handling the dead, which would prevent the spread of bacteria. The theory was wrong, but the behavior it encouraged was often epidemiologically sound. Physicians prescribed different types of baths for different ailments. Cold baths for fevers, because they thought it would cool the excess heat in the body. Hot baths for joint pain and muscle stiffness, because warmth provided relief. Steam baths for respiratory problems, because the vapor helped breathing. Saltwater baths for skin conditions. Herbal baths where medicinal plants were steeped in the water. Some of these worked. Some didn't, but all of them got people into water regularly, which had general health benefits regardless of the specific treatment rationale. The use of oil in medicine was extensive. Olive oil was considered healing in itself before you even added medicinal herbs to it. It was used to treat burns, applied directly to the burned skin where it would have provided some protective barrier against infection. It was used as a base for medicinal compounds, with various herbs steeped in oil to extract their properties. It was massaged into sore muscles and joints. Athletes used it preventively, believing it strengthened the body and made it more resistant to injury. Greek physicians also recognized the importance of mental health in maintaining physical cleanliness. They understood that depression or melancholy, as they called it, could lead to neglect of personal hygiene. They observed that people who stopped bathing and caring for their appearance were often suffering from some deeper malady. Their treatment for melancholy often included prescribed bathing and grooming, forcing the patient back into the rituals of self-care as a way of breaking the cycle of despair. Modern psychology has validated this approach. Maintaining hygiene routines can indeed help with depression, even if the mechanism has nothing to do with balancing black bile. The relationship between exercise and hygiene in Greek medicine was explicit and systematic. Physicians didn't just recommend exercise for general health. They prescribed specific exercise regimens tailored to individual constitutions and ailments. And every exercise prescription came with detailed instructions about pre-exercise preparation, oiling, and post-exercise cleaning. The physician Galen, who came later but built on Greek medical tradition, wrote an entire treatise on exercise and hygiene that remained influential for over 1,000 years. Water quality was a concern for Greek physicians. They distinguished between good water, clear, cold, from running sources or deep wells, and bad water, stagnant, warm, cloudy. They advised patients to seek out the best water sources and avoid contaminated supplies. Some physicians even conducted primitive water quality tests, observing how quickly water evaporated, whether it left residue, how it tasted. They didn't understand water chemistry, but they understood that some water was safe and some wasn't. The Greeks also had a category of professional health workers below physicians: the balneator, the bath attendants. These people weren't doctors, but they were trained in proper bathing techniques and were considered to have therapeutic knowledge. A skilled balneator knew how to heat water to the right temperature, how to apply steam, how to scrape skin without causing damage, how to massage sore muscles. Wealthy Greeks would have their favorite balneator, someone they trusted with their body the way they might trust a personal physician. Greek medical texts also addressed dental hygiene, though with less sophistication than bathing. They recommended rinsing the mouth with water or wine after eating. They suggested using toothpicks, usually made from wood or quill, to remove food particles. They prescribed various tooth powders made from ground pumice, crushed bone, or other abrasive materials, rubbed on with a finger or cloth. These would have had some cleaning effect, though they also would have damaged tooth enamel over time. Toothaches were treated with various herbal remedies or in severe cases, extraction. The Greeks understood that oral health affected overall health, even if their treatments were limited. One fascinating aspect of Greek medical hygiene was the practice of therapeutic vomiting and purging. Physicians believed that many diseases were caused by accumulated bad humors that needed to be expelled from the body. So they prescribed emetics to induce vomiting or purgatives to induce diarrhea. Before and after these treatments, extensive washing was required. The patient would bathe before treatment to open the pores and prepare the body, then again afterward to remove any remaining contamination. While the theory behind purging was nonsense, the associated bathing probably did help patients feel better, if only by getting them clean after a thoroughly unpleasant medical procedure. Greek physicians also recognized that too much bathing could be harmful. They warned against excessive washing, which they believed could weaken the body by removing too much natural oil or making the skin too soft. They advised that baths should be warm but not hot, as excessive heat could drain strength. They recommended that baths shouldn't last too long, as prolonged immersion was thought to waterlog the body. These concerns seem quaint now, but they reflect a sophisticated understanding that any intervention, even beneficial ones, needed to be used in moderation. The concept of the healing crisis in Greek medicine also involved hygiene. Physicians believed that diseases progressed through stages and that there was a critical point where the body would either overcome the illness or succumb to it. During this crisis period, strict hygiene protocols were enforced. The patient would be bathed regularly, sometimes multiple times a day. Their room would be cleaned and fumigated with aromatic smoke. Their clothing and bedding would be changed frequently. All visitors would have to wash before entering the sick room. Again, while the theory was wrong, the practice of intensive hygiene for seriously ill patients probably reduced secondary infections and improved outcomes. Greek military medicine had its own hygiene protocols. Army doctors understood that wounded soldiers needed to be kept clean to prevent their wounds from festering. They prescribed washing wounds with clean water, sometimes with wine, which has mild antiseptic properties due to its alcohol content. They recommended that soldiers bathe regularly even on campaign, using whatever water sources were available. They observed that armies that maintained good hygiene suffered fewer disease casualties than those that didn't. Some generals took this seriously, ensuring that camps were kept clean and that soldiers had access to water for washing. Others didn't, and their armies paid the price in disease and death. The treatment of women's health issues in Greek medicine involved extensive bathing and washing protocols. Physicians prescribed vaginal douches for various gynecological complaints, using water mixed with wine, vinegar, or herbal infusions. They recommended steam baths where women would sit over heated water infused with aromatic herbs, supposedly to treat uterine disorders. They believed that many women's health problems were caused by the wandering womb. Yes, they actually thought the uterus could move around inside the body, and they tried to lure it back into place using pleasant smells and steam. The theory was absurd, but the treatments, which mostly involved heat and moisture, probably did provide some symptomatic relief for menstrual cramps and other discomforts. Surgical procedures, which were limited but did exist in ancient Greece, required the highest standards of cleanliness that Greek medicine could achieve. Surgical instruments were cleaned before use, often by passing them through flame or washing them in wine. The surgical site would be washed thoroughly before cutting. After surgery, wounds would be bandaged with clean linen, and patients would be instructed to keep the area as clean as possible. Greek surgeons understood, through observation if not theory, that dirty wounds killed patients, and they did their best to maintain cleanliness even without understanding why it mattered. The role of diet in hygiene was also recognized by Greek physicians. They believed that what you ate affected not just your health but your cleanliness. Certain foods were thought to produce excessive sweat or bad breath and were to be avoided before social occasions or religious ceremonies. Other foods were believed to purify the body from within. The physician's prescription would often include dietary advice alongside bathing instructions, creating a comprehensive regimen for maintaining bodily purity. Greek physicians also dealt with infestations, lice, fleas, intestinal worms. These were common problems in the ancient world, and medicine had developed various treatments. For lice, they recommended frequent bathing and the application of certain oils that were supposed to suffocate the parasites. For intestinal worms, they prescribed various purgatives, again, designed to expel the worms from the body. The treatments had variable effectiveness, but they show that Greeks understood that some health problems were caused by visible organisms that could be removed through cleanliness or medication. The legacy of Greek medical hygiene is profound. When these texts were translated into Arabic during the medieval period, they influenced Islamic medical practice, which maintained much higher standards of hygiene than medieval Europe. When they were retranslated into Latin during the Renaissance, they helped revive interest in bathing and cleanliness as medical necessities. The Hippocratic emphasis on cleanliness, diet, and exercise as foundations of health remains influential in modern medicine, even though we now understand the mechanisms differently. So Greek medical hygiene, while based on incorrect theory, produced practical protocols that often worked. The Greeks couldn't see germs, but they could see that cleaning prevented disease. They didn't understand infection, but they understood that wounds needed to be kept clean. They didn't know about vitamins, but they knew that diet affected health. They built a sophisticated medical hygiene system through observation and reason, without the benefit of modern science. And much of their practical advice remains valid today, which is a remarkable achievement for a civilization working in the dark about the true causes of disease. Let's now examine the religious and ritual aspects of cleanliness in more depth, because for the Greeks, hygiene was never just practical. It was also, and perhaps primarily, a religious obligation. The Greeks believed that the gods cared deeply about cleanliness. A polluted person could not approach the divine. Before entering a temple, making a sacrifice, or participating in any religious ceremony, you had to be ritually clean. This meant, at minimum, washing your hands and face, and often meant a full bath. Every temple had a pararanterion, a basin of holy water near the entrance. You dip your hands in this water and sprinkle yourself before entering. This wasn't ordinary water. It had been specially prepared, often taken from a sacred spring, sometimes mixed with seawater and blessed by priests. The act of sprinkling yourself was called rantismos, and it was absolutely required. To enter a temple without performing it was sacrilege. Different religious occasions required different levels of purification. For casual worship or prayer, hand washing and sprinkling might suffice. For major festivals or sacrifices, you needed a full bath, often at a specific sacred spring or bathhouse. For the most important mysteries, like those at Eleusis, initiates underwent elaborate purification rituals that lasted days and involved multiple baths, fasting, and various other practices designed to strip away all traces of pollution. The concept of pollution in Greek religion was complex and often strange to modern minds. You became polluted by contact with death, so attending a funeral made you temporarily unclean. You had to bathe before you could enter a temple or participate in normal social life. Childbirth also caused pollution, both for the mother and anyone who assisted her. Blood from wounds or menstruation was polluting. Even sexual activity caused a mild pollution that required washing before religious activities. Murder was the most severe form of pollution. A murderer carried a miasma so powerful that it could contaminate an entire city if not purified. The purification rituals for homicide were elaborate and could involve bathing in specific rivers, sacrifice of piglets whose blood would wash away the blood guilt, and exile until the pollution faded. These rituals were taken extremely seriously. A city that harbored an unpurified murderer risked divine wrath in the form of plague, famine, or military defeat. Certain sanctuaries had especially strict purity requirements. The sanctuary of Asclepius, god of healing, where sick people went to seek cures, required all visitors to bathe before entering the sacred precinct. They had to be clean to receive divine healing. The sanctuary of Apollo at Delphi, home of the famous oracle, had similar requirements. Pilgrims would bathe in the Castalian spring before ascending to the temple to consult the Pythia. The Olympic Games, held at Olympia in honor of Zeus, were as much religious festival as athletic competition. Athletes arriving for the games had to undergo purification rituals, including bathing in the Alpheus River. They had to be ritually clean to compete in contests held on sacred ground. Winning at the Olympics wasn't just athletic achievement. It was divine favor, and you couldn't receive divine favor while polluted. Women had their own religious purification practices, particularly around menstruation and childbirth. Menstruating women were generally excluded from religious activities and had to undergo purification afterward before resuming normal worship. After childbirth, a new mother would remain in seclusion for a period, usually 40 days, before undergoing a purification bath and sacrifice that allowed her to re-enter public and religious life. These practices, while based on ideas about pollution that we'd reject today, did give women a legitimate reason to rest and recover after childbirth, which had practical health benefits. The role of priests and priestesses in Greek religion involved maintaining strict personal purity. They had to bathe more frequently than ordinary people, follow stricter dietary rules, and avoid certain activities that might cause pollution. Some priests and priestesses were required to remain celibate during their period of service, as sexual activity, while not forbidden to regular people, was considered incompatible with the highest levels of ritual purity. The priest or priestess who performed sacrifices had to be spotlessly clean, as they were acting as intermediaries between humans and gods. Sacred springs and wells were scattered throughout the Greek world. These were believed to have special purifying properties, often because they were associated with a particular deity. The spring at Delphi was sacred to Apollo. Certain springs were dedicated to the nymphs, others to various healing deities. Bathing in these springs was believed to be more effective for purification than bathing in ordinary water. Pilgrims would travel long distances to bathe in particularly famous sacred springs. The purification of objects was also important. Any item that would be used in religious ritual had to be ritually cleaned. Sacrificial knives were washed and blessed before use. Temple vessels were kept in a state of purity. Even statues of gods were occasionally bathed in special ceremonies, where the cult statue would be taken from the temple, washed in a sacred spring or the sea, and returned with great ceremony. These statue bathing rituals, called plinteria, were major religious festivals in some cities. The connection between physical and ritual cleanliness was never entirely clear. The Greeks understood that ritual purification required physical washing, but they also believed that the ritual aspect was separate from and more important than the physical. You could be physically clean but ritually polluted, or vice versa. A murderer could bathe 100 times, but without the proper ritual purification involving sacrifice and priestly blessing, the pollution remained. This dual nature of cleanliness, physical and spiritual, meant that hygiene in Greece was never purely practical. Every bath could have religious significance. Every act of washing could be a gesture toward the divine. The line between getting clean for social reasons and getting clean for religious reasons was blurry at best. In practice, most Greeks probably didn't distinguish sharply between the two. You washed because it was what civilized people did, and being civilized meant being acceptable to both humans and gods. Certain Greek philosophical schools developed their own hygiene practices based on their beliefs about the body and soul. The Pythagoreans, followers of Pythagoras, had elaborate purity rules including frequent bathing, dietary restrictions, and avoidance of certain substances. They believed the soul was imprisoned in the body and that purification could help free it or at least make its imprisonment more bearable. The Cynics, in contrast, deliberately rejected conventional hygiene as part of their rejection of social norms. Diogenes, the most famous cynic, reportedly bathed rarely and lived in a jar, flaunting his contempt for the customs that other Greeks held sacred. His point was that true virtue had nothing to do with external cleanliness, only internal philosophical purity. The mystery religions that became popular in later Greek periods, particularly the mysteries of Demeter at Eleusis, made purification central to their initiatory rites. Candidates for initiation would undergo extensive purification, including fasting, bathing in the sea at Phaleron, and abstaining from certain foods and activities. This purification was believed to prepare the soul for the revelation of sacred mysteries that promised a better afterlife. The exact nature of these mysteries was secret, but the purification rituals were public and elaborate, lasting several days. Funeral customs also involved extensive purification. After someone died, the body would be washed and anointed by female relatives. Those who washed the corpse became polluted and had to undergo purification themselves afterward. Mourners attending the funeral were also polluted by proximity to death and had to bathe before resuming normal activities. The house where someone died would be swept and purified with seawater. All of these rituals reinforced the idea that death was the ultimate pollution and that contact with it required the most thorough cleaning. The Greek understanding of purification influenced later religious traditions. Early Christianity, which emerged in a Greek-speaking world, adopted and adapted Greek purification practices. Baptism, the central Christian initiatory rite, uses water for spiritual purification in a way that echoes Greek ritual bathing. The Christian emphasis on being washed clean of sin has roots in Greek concepts of pollution and purification, though transformed by Christian theology. So when we think about Greek cleanliness, we can't separate the physical from the spiritual, the practical from the religious. They were intertwined in ways that seem foreign to our modern, secular understanding of hygiene. For the Greeks, staying clean wasn't just about health or social acceptability. It was about maintaining right relationship with the gods, about being worthy to participate in the sacred, about ensuring that your community didn't suffer divine punishment because you were polluted. This meant that hygiene in Greece had a moral weight it doesn't carry in most modern societies. We wash because it's healthy and polite. The Greeks washed because they believed their souls, their cities, and their relationship with the divine depended on it. That's a very different motivation, and it produced a very different culture of cleanliness. Let's explore one more dimension of Greek hygiene that we haven't fully addressed: the economics of staying clean and how social class determined access to cleanliness. Cleanliness in ancient Greece wasn't free. It required resources, time, labor, and access to facilities. This meant that hygiene was, inevitably, stratified by class. The wealthy could afford to be cleaner than the poor, and everyone knew it. Start with the most basic resource: water. As we've discussed, water had to be carried from public fountains or wells. This labor was usually performed by women and slaves. A wealthy household with many slaves could have water constantly available for washing. A poor household with no slaves meant the women of the family spent hours each day hauling water, leaving less time for everything else. And the water they hauled had to be rationed carefully between drinking, cooking, and washing, with washing often getting the smallest share. Olive oil, the foundation of Greek hygiene, also cost money. It wasn't expensive for the wealthy, but for the poor, using oil for washing competed with using it for food and lighting. A laborer might have to choose between oiling himself before exercise at the gymnasium and having oil for his dinner. Most chose to skip the gymnasium entirely, which meant they had less access to the facilities and social benefits it provided. The gymnasium itself, while theoretically open to all citizens, had practical barriers for the poor. It required leisure time. A wealthy man could spend hours each day at the gymnasium, exercising, bathing, and socializing. A working man, who had to labor from dawn to dusk just to feed his family, couldn't afford that time. Some gymnasiums also charged fees, though usually small ones. But even a small fee could be prohibitive for the poorest citizens. The result was that the gymnasium culture, so central to Greek male identity, was really a culture of leisured men, not all men. Public baths were more accessible. The fees were low, designed to allow even poor citizens to bathe occasionally. But even these small fees added up. A family paying to bathe even once a week at a public bath was spending money that could have bought food. For the truly poor, bathing at the public baths was an occasional luxury, not a regular practice. This meant that the poor were, simply put, dirtier than the rich. They bathed less often. They used cheaper oil or no oil. They couldn't afford perfume. Their clothing, which they had less of and washed less frequently, smelled of sweat and labor. This was visible and olfactory evidence of their social status. You could tell poor people by how they smelled. The social consequences were significant. Cleanliness was associated with virtue, sophistication, and civilized behavior. Dirtiness was associated with poverty, labor, and barbarism. This meant that poor people weren't just economically disadvantaged. They were morally judged for their inability to maintain the same hygiene standards as the wealthy. It was a vicious circle. Poverty made cleanliness harder, and lack of cleanliness reinforced social prejudices against the poor. Slaves had it even worse. They did the dirty work, hauling water, cleaning chamber pots, scraping floors covered in gloyos. They were constantly exposed to filth as part of their labor. Yet they also had to maintain presentable appearance, especially household slaves who served their masters directly. A slave who smelled too bad would be beaten. But slaves often had no access to the resources needed to stay clean. They might wash in leftover water from their master's bath or rinse themselves at public fountains when no one was looking. Slaves who worked at the gymnasium or public baths at least had access to facilities, though using them when they were supposed to be working could be punished. Women's access to hygiene resources was mediated by the men in their lives. A woman in a wealthy household could bathe regularly, use expensive cosmetics, and have slaves to help her. A woman in a poor household had to haul her own water, make do with cheap or no cosmetics, and bathe rarely. Women had less access than men to public facilities, as the baths and gymnasiums were primarily male spaces. This meant women's cleanliness depended entirely on domestic resources, which varied wildly by class. The cosmetics industry, and it was an industry, catered to different economic levels. The wealthy could afford imported perfumes, expensive dyes for cosmetics, and elaborate grooming tools made of precious metals. The poor made do with locally produced oils, simple plant-based cosmetics, and basic tools. The difference was visible. A wealthy woman's makeup was smooth and even, applied with precision. A poor woman's makeup, if she could afford any, was rough and uneven. These visual markers reinforced class distinctions every time people looked at each other. Dentistry, such as it was also class stratified. The wealthy could afford to see physicians about tooth problems and could pay for the various treatments, usually extraction, that were available. The poor lived with toothaches until the tooth fell out or the pain drove them to desperate measures like trying to pull it themselves. This meant that the poor had worse oral health, more missing teeth, and more visible signs of dental decay. Smile, and everyone knew your economic status. Hair care was another marker of class. The wealthy had time and resources to maintain elaborate hairstyles, to wash their hair regularly with expensive preparations, and to visit barbers and hair stylists. The poor cut their own hair or had it cut by family members, washed it rarely, and wore simple styles that required little maintenance. In Athens, there was even a political dimension to this. Democratic politicians sometimes made a point of wearing simple hairstyles and foregoing excessive grooming to show solidarity with common people, while aristocrats maintained elaborate hairstyles as a mark of their status. The cloth trade also reflects hygiene economics. The wealthy had many changes of clothing, which meant they could wear clean clothes daily. Their clothing was made of finer materials that were easier to wash and didn't hold odor as badly. The poor had fewer clothes, sometimes only one tunic, which they wore continuously and washed rarely. Woolen garments, common among all classes, were difficult to clean and held odor. But the wealthy could afford to replace them more often. Access to slaves for personal grooming was perhaps the starkest dividing line. A wealthy man would have slaves to pour water for his morning wash, to oil him before exercise, to scrape him with the strigil afterward, to bathe him at home if he chose not to go to the public baths. He never had to touch these tasks himself. A poor man did everything himself, which was more time-consuming and less thorough. The quality of cleaning you could achieve with help was simply better than what you could do alone. Certain luxury hygiene practices were entirely the preserve of the wealthy. Spa-like treatments involving honey, milk baths, elaborate massage with expensive oils, application of exotic cosmetics, professional depilation, all of these cost money that only the rich had. These weren't just cleanliness. They were conspicuous consumption, ways of displaying wealth through the body. Children's hygiene also varied by class. Wealthy children were bathed regularly by nurses, taught proper grooming habits, and had access to the gymnasium for physical education as they grew. Poor children were lucky to be washed occasionally, learned hygiene only informally from overworked parents, and often never entered a gymnasium in their lives. The habits formed in childhood persisted, creating hygiene practices that reinforced class identity across generations. The irony is that the people who most needed good hygiene, the poor who lived in more crowded conditions with worse sanitation, had the least access to it. Meanwhile, the wealthy, who lived in larger, airier houses with better waste disposal, could afford to bathe daily. This disparity contributed to disease patterns where the poor suffered more from infections and epidemics than the rich, though everyone was at risk before modern medicine. Some Greeks recognized this disparity as unjust. Democratic reformers occasionally provided free or subsidized access to baths as part of social welfare programs. Some wealthy citizens, as a form of public benefaction, would fund construction of new baths or subsidize existing ones to lower fees for citizens. But these efforts were piecemeal and never eliminated the fundamental connection between wealth and cleanliness. The philosophical implications were occasionally discussed. If cleanliness was virtuous, and virtue was supposed to be accessible to all citizens, wasn't it unjust that the poor couldn't afford to be as clean as the rich? Some philosophers argued that true virtue was internal and had nothing to do with external cleanliness. Others maintained that the appearance of virtue, which included cleanliness, was inseparable from virtue itself. These debates never really resolved, but they show that Greeks were aware that their hygiene system was unequal. Foreign visitors to Greece sometimes commented on these disparities. Visitors from Persia, where bathing culture was also highly developed but perhaps more accessible across classes, noted that Greek cities had beautiful public buildings but streets full of poorly washed poor people. Egyptian visitors, coming from a culture with different hygiene practices, were puzzled by the Greek obsession with oil and scraping and noted that it seemed to benefit the wealthy far more than the masses. So when we study Greek hygiene, we're not just learning about scraping and oil. We're learning about how a civilization maintained itself, how it thought about the body, how it structured social life, how it defined cleanliness and virtue. And that makes ancient Greek hygiene, strange as it seems, worthy of attention. Because understanding how the Greeks stayed clean helps us understand how the Greeks were Greek. And with that, we've traced the full arc of Greek cleanliness from morning face washing to gymnasium rituals to public baths to the legacy that extends into our own bathrooms. The Greeks managed to stay clean without soap or showers through a combination of oil, scraping tools, public baths, and an enormous amount of social structure. It wasn't perfect. It wasn't what we'd consider hygienic today. But it worked well enough to support one of history's greatest civilizations. So the next time you step into a hot shower, squeeze out some body wash, and stand under running water that's exactly the temperature you want, take a moment to appreciate what you have. Because for the ancient Greeks, this would have seemed like divine luxury, a gift from the gods themselves. They made do with oil and bronze scrapers and basins of water carried from fountains. And somehow, despite all that, they still managed to create philosophy, democracy, art, and literature that changed the world. Not bad for a civilization that never invented soap.